Hello, welcome to this video on habit. I thought it would be interesting to have a look at what philosophers have to say about habit. Because habit is something we find talked about quite a lot today in books and videos about self-improvement, self-help, and generally ideas about how to improve your life. So I thought it would be interesting to go in and have a look at what Hegel has to say about habit. And for this, I thought we should just simply read what he writes and then try to make sense of it together. So I hope you are comfortable and grab your book if you have it. If not, then you're welcome to listen along, and I hope you learn something. So this is from the book Philosophy of Spirit, or Philosophy of Mind, as it's sometimes translated, and we are going to see at what Hegel has to say. So this is a subsection titled Habit. So we're going to go straight into it. Usually it's helpful to have a bit of context by thinking about the derivation to how we got there. But for now, I thought it would just be better to just go straight into the matter and see what happens, see how much we can make sense of it. And then maybe for another video, we can go backtrack, see how habit is derived. So Hegel writes, paragraph 409, self-feeling, immersed in the particularity of the feelings of simple sensations and also desires, urges, passions, and gratifications, is not distinguished from them. So what Hegel is saying here is that when you're feeling yourself, what he calls self-feeling or Selbstgefühl, it's something that is not feeling itself in the abstract. It's always feeling itself in some sort of particular embodied situation. It's immersed in the particularity of feelings, and it's not distinguished from them. So we have an idea of whenever you feel something, the hardness of the table, it is you feeling yourself feeling the hardness of the table, if that makes sense. So there is a kind of self-referential loop that is at work in any kind of feeling of something else. Now you can also think about emotions like sadness, joy, and so forth. There is a sense in which there is this self-referential self-feeling that is immersed in the particular feeling of this or that qualitative emotion or sensation. So that is how I see Hegel outlining here from the very beginning. Okay, let's continue. But the self is implicitly a simple relation of ideality to itself, formal universality, and this is the truth of the particular. In this life of feeling, the self is to be posited as this universality. Thus, it is the universality that distinguishes itself from particularity, the universality that is for itself. Okay, so there's a lot of things happening here. So I think in the first clause of the sentence, before the semicolon, self, there Hegel defines the self, right? Not self-feeling, but self as such. It's a simple relation of ideality to itself. Ideality means here, I think, a moment. Because ideal, we find that emerging in the logic of infinity from the science of logic, and that is all about relating to another whereby you return to yourself. But you relate to that other as a moment, and so you're relating to yourself as a whole in a part. It's kind of complicated logic that is at work there. But what is important for us is that we simply focus on the simple relationality of it. And then Hegel gives another clue, formal universality. As I was saying before, is a simple sort of self-referentiality that is at work. When I was talking about self-feeling, so the self of the self-feeling is this self-connecting loop, almost like a tautology. Yes, and then he writes, it's the truth of the particular. So by that, I think he simply stresses that the particular doesn't just exist as such. It is a particular for someone or something. And in our case, it is for self-consciousness, for a subject. In this life of feeling, the self is to be posited as this universality. Yeah, so again, this connects up with the self-feeling that is immersed in the particularity of feelings, and it is understood distinctly from the particularity as this self-revolving, self-referential dynamic relation. Thus, it is the universality that distinguishes itself from particularity, the universality that is for itself. So, with that, this sort of completes the distinction, because, okay, there is a feeling of something specific, the hardness of the table, my sadness over not being able to visit the doctor, or what have you. But it's also that I can distinguish myself from those specificities. It is me, the I, feeling, and so I am, in a way, as Hegel technically puts it, for myself, or for itself as he writes it here. Okay, so he moves on. This universality is not the content-packed truth of the determinate sensations, desires, etc., for their content does not yet come into consideration here. So once we abstract the universal, the self-referential feeling for oneself, it is in a way empty. So it is not determinate in and of itself. The you in you feeling this or that is empty, is transparent, is void, because you are feeling something out there, right? And if you're going to be able to feel that transparently, nothing of you can logically obscure that. Otherwise, you would not be relating to what's out there. And even, Hegel might add, you wouldn't even be relating to yourself without that relation to what's out there. So the two are connected. Okay, then he moves on. Particularity is, in this determination, just as formal. It is only the particular being or immediacy of the soul, in contrast to its equally formal, abstract being for itself, or being for self. So, if we think of particularity just as particularity, then it seems as something that stands up and against the being for itself. Now, we're thinking of it in the abstract, not as the emotion of sadness or joy or the feeling of hardness of table. If we try to abstract away from all of that, what we are left with is a pure sense of particularity. But it is just as formal, Hegel says. And what is really giving it a kind of contrast to the other formality of the universal is that it is an immediacy of the soul, as he puts it here. So, thinking logically at the structure that must obtain here, there is something against which the self-relating universal comes up against, that is at this point for it simply something immediate. So we move on. This particular being of the soul is the moment of its bodiliness. Here it breaks with this bodiliness, distinguishing from itself from it itself as its simple being, and becomes the ideal, subjective substantiality of this bodiliness, just as in its implicit concept it was only the unqualified substance of bodiliness. So what is going on here? The particular being of the soul is the moment of its bodiliness. Here it breaks with this bodiliness, distinguishing from itself its simple being, and becomes the ideal subjective substantiality of this bodiliness. So here I think really is the crux of the logic. So the particular being of the soul, the immediacy, is something that negates mediation. So the self-referentiality of the formal universal has to be negated at the point of the particular being. However, when the self-referential universality, the self-feeling loop, so to speak, comes back to itself from the particular, it is essentially a break with the bodiliness, a break with the immediacy. So it's distinguishing from it itself as its simple being, and becomes the ideal subjective substantiality of this bodiliness. So we have a distinction here between something taking a stance against itself, against something that is, I might say, immediate or solid, and we would think that this means that, well, hang on, we have a difference here. But Hegel immediately then goes on to say it is distinguishing as a simple being, and in doing that it becomes immersed once more with that bodiliness. So it doesn't hover above or stay independent of that bodiliness, of that immediacy, but it reintegrates itself with it. But in doing so, it precisely becomes the ideal, a subjective substantiality, as Hegel puts it. So let us then move on down to the remark here, because those can be helpful to unpack, well, what's going on. So Hegel goes on to say there, this abstract being for self of the soul in its bodiliness is not yet I, the existence of the universal that is for the universal. So here he cautions us not to think of this being for itself as the fully fledged Kantian I, as the unity of apperception, the thing that is knowingly for itself. It is a step below that, and yet it is not something that is completely at one with whatever is the case regarding bodily functions or immediacy or sensations. So all of this Hegel brings out from the idea of feeling, and that he, according to Hegel, feeling implicitly presupposes self-feeling. Well, what is this self in the self-feeling? And this is what he's been unpacking. At this stage, we are just interested in, Hegel just cautions us again that we are not dealing with the Kantian I, the sort of Cartesian cogito. We are at a step below that somewhere. He goes on, it is bodiliness reduced to its pure ideality, and bodiliness thus pertains to the soul as such. There is an interesting sentence. How on earth can bodiliness pertain to the soul as such. These are just classically dualistic categories, body and soul, never shall they meet, right? But for Hegel, bodiliness, reduced to its pure ideality, reduced to its simplicity we might say, is what pertains to the soul as such. And then it goes on, that is, just as space and time are abstract and asunderness, as therefore empty space and empty time are only subjective forms of pure intuition, so that pure being, which, owing to the sublation in it of the particularity of bodiliness, i.e. of immediate bodiliness as such, is being for itself, is the entirely pure intuition, unconscious, but the foundation of consciousness. Remember, this is all before Freud. This is Hegel, before that kind of the psychology of the unconscious really took off. And he's able to do this thinking just about the idea of feeling. Right, so let's unpack that sentence a little bit. So time and space are only subjective forms, pure intuition. There we immediately see a link to Kant, right? And that doesn't mean that time and space doesn't exist in nature. It's just that those categories that exist in nature in the philosophy of nature. Here we are in the philosophy of spirit or mind, and so time and space are something for the minded creature. They play a particular role. And so I think that in this sense, the role they play is one that is specific to that being. So we can see here that I think Hegel lines up with Kant's notion of how this works out for having the kind of conscious experience human beings have, and that he largely agrees with Kant from within this perspective, insofar as we are dealing with the philosophy of mind or spirit. Now, he goes on, so that pure being, which owing to the sublation of the particularity of the bodiliness, of immediate bodiliness as such, is being for itself, is the entirely pure intuition, unconscious, but the foundation of consciousness. So here, Hegel seems to be saying that owing to the sublation in it of the particularity of bodiliness, okay, so he seems to say here that what is unconscious is entirely pure intuition. And at this point, what that means is simply that it's a kind of sheer immediacy of bodiliness. Nonetheless, this sheer immediacy, this simplicity, aligns with the being for self. It's an interesting thing there. So you would think that the being for self would be something completely other to the immediate bodiliness as such. But at this point, the immediate bodiliness is so immediate that the being for self is formally indistinguishable from it. Because both, remember from the paragraph above, both were formal determinations. And then he goes on to close it with, it's the foundation of consciousness. So this is all taking place in the section titled Anthropology, and there Hegel deals with the immediacy of mind, or the immediacy of spirit, the immediacy of human-minded activity. And this activity at this point is not something that has risen to full self-reflective consciousness. But neither is it mere animal life, instinctual, automatic almost mechanical living. It is in a space between. But this space between, Hegel already thinks of, well, this is going to be important for later what's going to be the fully fledged sense of consciousness, the purely reflective cogito or I. So let us wrap up this remark. It proceeds within itself to consciousness, since it has sublated within itself the bodiliness, of which it is the subjective substance, and which is still for it and constitutes a barrier. And thus it is posited as a subject for itself. So, it proceeds within itself to consciousness. Why does it do that? Well, because it has sublated within itself the bodiliness. Why is the bodiliness sublated? Well, because it is taken together in a simplicity, in an immediate simplicity. And so it almost reminds me of Deleuze's idea of body without organs. Now, I don't know the concept of that, but just the name, like a body without organs, is like suggesting that there is a body without any sort of determinate particularity involved. The determinate particularity has been reduced down to the sheer bodiness, which at this stage is just something immediate. But precisely this immediacy, precisely this simple relation, therefore has moved above and beyond the immediacy of bodiliness, of body as such. Just thinking of body as such is taking it into a whole that is not grasped in the individual moments. Because, okay, if we're gonna think about the body as we normally do, we think of it in a determinate way, as, you know, having appendages, digits, and lots and lots of systems going on and so forth. But Hegel thinks that it can be thought in the other extreme, and by doing so, we have unearthed a sense of an ideal identity, or what he calls a subjective substance. Now, this, he says, is for it, so I suppose here the being for itself, and therefore constitutes a barrier. So the being for itself, I suppose here can be linked up with subjectivity as such. So there is a subjectivity involved with the bodiliness, but it's being distinguished from it because of the bodiliness being understood as a whole. Once it is distinguished from the bodiliness, well, it is just posited as a subject for itself, Hegel ends. Now let's read on. That the soul thus makes itself into an abstract universal being and reduces the particularity of feelings, of consciousness too, to a determination in it that just is habit. Now we have suddenly in the domain of habit. So how did we get here? How does Hegel use the name habit here? So habit here is all about seeming to reduce particularity of something, in this case feelings, to a determination that just is, to a determination that just is immediate. And notice that it isn't something that just happens, but is a reduction, or that the soul thus makes itself. Now, when we are taking up a new habit, we are forcing ourselves into a certain situation where I hold an instrument in a certain way and I put my hands and fingers down and select places. There's a whole lot of mechanics involved there. But fundamentally, logically, I think it's all about reducing one's sense of oneself into an immediacy. That might sound strange, but if we think of it in the reverse, what is a habit is that it comes to us immediately. I practice habit, guitar or dancing. I don't need to think about it once I've learned it. It just comes out of me. Well, Hegel is kind of analyzing this in the reverse, in the way of like what is actually going on with the intellect, what he here terms the soul, which is just like an unconscious being that is on its way to becoming conscious, is doing with regards to its bodiliness. So he continues, in this way the soul has the content in possession. It contains it in such a way that in such determination it is not actually sentient. It does not stand in relationship to them by distinguishing itself from them, nor is it absorbed in them, but it has them in itself and moves in them, without sensation or consciousness. It's really interesting phenomenological characterization that Hegel gives us here. Just again, whether you're dancing, drawing, programming, or learning a language, you are in possession of skills. But those skills aren't you don't relate to those skills as if you relate to a certain object outside of you, right? So here I have my phone, there it is there, I am now sentient of it, there is a camera, and here are some glasses, right? The relationship we have with our own habits, Hegel points out here, is something we are in possession of, but in immediate possession. So it does not stand in relationship to them by distinguishing itself from them, i.e., I am not some independent being that is apart from all my skills and habits. Nor am I simply absorbed in them as if I wasn't thinking about them or having a sense of myself in them. Let's put it like that, because we're not having we don't have a cogito here, so it's better to use a sense of oneself. There is self-feeling involved. That's the kind of pre-Kantian I that is developing itself here. So it's not positing itself apart from them, but has them in itself, and it moves in them. Just as, whether I go down to go dancing or go biking, these skills, traits, habits I have are something I move, or my sense of self, my self-feeling move in them. Now, this movement is itself not something you have a sensation of or are conscious of, as Hegel points out at the end of the sentence here. So he really interestingly, I think, describes this in a way that yes, there is a distinction going on between ourselves and our skills. We do it all the time, right? And yet we shouldn't think of them as some items that we can point to or we come to encounter as if we were some completely separate beings apart from them. This relationship is of a much more intimate contact, and in a way we swirl around our skills, just as my thoughts are swirling around the skill I have of moving my mouth, generating noises that are coherently understood as English. Hegel goes on, the soul is free of them insofar as it is not interested in or occupied with them. While it exists in these forms as its possessions, it is at the same time open to other activity and occupants in the sphere of sensation and the mind's consciousness in general. So I think the latter phrase, the latter part of the sentence here, is looking ahead once we have an established cogito and mind that we are thinking about. But already at this stage, there is freedom. Freedom insofar as you are not actively working on your habits. Only insofar as you have them in your possession, but you're not thinking about them. So in a strange way, when you're learning a new skill, you are maximally unfree. You have to sort of bow down to the necessity of whatever it is you're dealing with, whether it's the guitar, the piano, the dancing, and it all feels very awkward. You have to absorb your mind or your sense of self or your self-feeling in the particularities of the thing. But as it actually becomes part of you, as you take possession of it, in the Hegel sense here, you need not be as aware or occupied with particularities anymore, because in a way you already have them. They are now part of you and you are part of them. So the necessity has risen to a freedom. You now know what you need to do to play this chord on the guitar, or that song, or dance tango, or cycle down the road. You don't have to worry about your where you put your hands and feet when you're going down cycling. You can just decide where you're going to cycle to. And in that way, you now are free. But it's a freedom that's come out of this process of necessity. So, Hegel goes on, this self-incorporation of the particularity of the particularity or bodiliness of the determinations of feeling into the being of the soul, the immediacy of the soul, appears as a repetition of them, and the production of habit appears as practice. For since this being is in relation to the natural particular material that is put into this form, abstract universality, it is universality of reflection. One at the same item as an external polarity of sensation is reduced to its unity, and this abstract unity is posited. So there in this passage, Hegel brings out repetition, which any kind of habit normally or skill that we're learning is going to require lots and lots of repetition. Learning a language, cycling down the road. And so the production of habit appears as practice. Yeah, straightforward, obvious, yeah. But then he goes on, since this being is in relation to the natural particular being material that is put into this form, absolute universality, it is universality of reflection. So it seems that Hegel here is combining the two thoughts of, well, there is some specific particularity that is natural, usually is, right? We're learning various different sounds, cycling again, guitar, and so on and so forth. It is put into the form of the abstract universality, or into the self-feeling being, into the being that has a sense of itself. But then we need to update our sense of this absolute universality. It's not simply immediate, and it's certainly not immediate when we are thinking that, well, hang on, this is happening through multiple repetitions. So it seems that Hegel is adding a richer sense of universality, calling it universality of reflection. And reflection here is, we should think in terms of meaning something that is reflexive, something that is self-relating. Well, I am relating to myself in a particular practice that I'm doing, whether it's jogging or learning to play guitar or drawing or programming or what have you. So it's just that Hegel gives us a little bit of a richer sense of the self-feeling being here by using the category of universality of reflection. Now, I think the last sentence is just an extra qualifier, because what's really going on when you're learning a habit is you are taking something natural, particular material, something very corporeal, and you're adding it to yourself. But logically, it's not like you just like you're cycling down the road and boom, there is the kind of blueprint, or there is this kind of activity that you can just pick up and point to and deposit into yourself as if you were kind of some sort of machine or robot, right? No, it's you as a being are adapting to various different movement. This is what happens in reality, but logically it is the specificity of what's out there that is being adapted to the universal unity that is the self-being entity, the self-feeling entity, I mean. It is reduced to its unity, Hegel puts it. And so, through this process, that abstract unity becomes posited. It becomes really something for itself in and through the kind of activities it is doing. Because these activities now become part of it through that reduction. So let's read on a little bit more. I don't think we should carry on for too long. As you can see, Hegel has lots and lots to say about habit, but I think for now it's good. We have made a good start of it, I think, and I would just like to read a little bit from the remark, because it seems really interesting, right? He talks about habit and then memory. So, habit, like memory, is a hard point in organization of the mind. Very strange, unphilosophical language he uses there, but okay. Habit is the mechanism of self-feeling, as memory is the mechanism of intelligence. The natural qualities and alterations of age, of sleeping and waking are immediately natural. Habit is the determinacy of feeling, as well of intelligence, will, etc., insofar as they belong to self-feeling, made into something that is natural, mechanical. Habit has rightly been called a second nature. Nature, because it is an immediate being of the soul. A second nature, because it is an immediacy posited by the soul, incorporating and molding the bodiliness that pertains to the determinations of feeling as such, and the determinacies of representation and of the will insofar as they are embodied. Really fascinating stuff Hegel says here about habit. So let's go to the very beginning of that paragraph. Now, mechanism here, we shouldn't really think of in terms of a kind of thing that is operating in a certain way, like a brain or muscles or a machine. I don't think that's what Hegel has in mind here. He thinks of mechanism as a arrangement of things that are working together, but they are working together because they are defined by indifferent externality. This is really what mechanism logically is for Hegel. Not really that there is a thing. Like, this concept applies to any kind of thing that we normally call mechanism, but what Hegel wants us to think about is this idea of external indifference that is at work here. So when I am putting my fingers onto the frets and the strings on the guitar, I am not dancing. I am not cycling. I have to exclude a whole bunch of other things in order to do this activity. And because it is natural, the kind of thing I'm dealing with, the guitar is, a thing, and it is made up of strings and so on. You could say that there is mechanical movement because of my body. But I think the mechanism here is more of a logical point. It means more something that you are excluding a bunch of things in doing what you're doing. Now, maybe I grant that I could maybe be reading this a little bit wrongly. No, let me see. So, mechanism of self-feeling. So, the feeling relates itself to some natural entity out there, whether it's a guitar, a bike, whatever, right? And it's the starting point of its relationship to that thing is that it's externally indifferent to it. So when you're learning something new, it's very mechanical. It is, it's alienating, it's strange, it's something out of you. You're externally indifferent to it, and it's indifferent to you because you don't know how to handle it yet. And so it feels like it doesn't really want you to handle it, right? The guitar, the bike, what have you. They're just like, they don't want you on them, so to speak, or using them. But it is in and through this mechanism that then the habit formation is taking place, not apart from it. And it maintains that as a moment of itself. Okay, let's proceed. The natural qualities and alterations of age, sleeping, and so on and so forth are completely natural. So these Hegel doesn't think of as habits. They are more strictly natural, strictly instinctual. They are beyond the possibility to really alter to a very significant degree by the self-feeling being. Now, of course, probably to some extreme, yes, you can train yourself to slow down your heart rate, right? But that is not as significant, Hegel thinks, as you being able to take on new skills. That is really a wonder. Okay, habit is the determinacy of feeling made into something that is natural, mechanical. So, when you're learning a habit, you think of it as something that's out there, and that you're taking it in. You're taking possession of the skill, and you're taking it into yourself. Well, Hegel also thinks that there is logically another movement that is taking place, and that is namely that the self-feeling being is rendering itself into something corporeal and natural and mechanical. It is formally extending itself into the thing. Now, Hegel adds, habit has been rightly called second nature. Nature because it is an immediate being of the soul. So there is a wonderful play on words here, because you can also take nature to mean, yes, this is the immediate being of the soul, but it's also something natural out there. And then a second nature because it is an immediacy posited by the soul, incorporating and molding the bodily needs that pertains to determinations of feeling as such. So posited here means simply that it is distinguished from the soul, not as something that the soul is aware of in an intellectual fashion, but in a way in which it becomes part of the soul's repertoire of being that it can take or enter into. That is, I think, what positing here means. So it's more of a kind of marker for us thinking about it. and in the way in which something that relating to itself is distinguishing itself from something else, but not in an intellectual or even sensuous way. Incorporating and molding the bodiness that pertains to determinations of feeling as such, determinacies and to the determinacies of representation of the will insofar as they are embodied. So, will is not yet developed, I think, in this section. So Hegel is again looking forward, because habit is going to be something that is pertinent and carries over into the later stages of the soul, which then becomes conscious. But at this stage, he just is saying that, well, once again, because they are relying on the formation of habit, they are determinate because they are embodied. In habit, man's mode of existence is natural, and for that reason he is unfree in it. But he is free insofar as the natural determinacy of sensation is by habit reduced to his mere being. He is no longer different from it. He is indifferent to it, and so no longer interested, engaged, or dependent with respect to it. So it seems that Hegel is saying that if we're thinking of habits simply on natural terms, well, then there is no freedom involved here. But freedom becomes relevant insofar as habit is something that is reduced to our being, to our sense of ourselves. It's not that we are different from our habits. In a way, we become indifferent to it. And so this is maybe putting it too specifically, but once you've learned the guitar, you're no longer interested in it. Or once you've learned language, you're able to speak English, you're no longer engaged or dependent on it. It is just, it is now reduced to your being, and you are in possession of it. I think this is what Hegel means with indifference in this passage. The unfreedom of habit, or the unfreedom in habit, is partially just formal, pertaining only to the being of the soul. So this here, very important to note, only to the being of the soul, only to the immediacy of the soul, partly only relative, insofar as it really arises only in the case of bad habits. Yeah, well, this is a funny paradox, right? We constantly notice our bad habits, but not our good habits, because we're just at home in them, so we're free in them. Or insofar as a habit is opposed by another purpose. The habit of right in general, of the ethical, has the content of freedom. Now that's interesting. This is something you won't find many normative philosophers talking very much about. The role of habit in right, in the what is just and fair, and so on. But for Hegel, habit plays a crucial role in society, in the ethical substance. It's just that it is habit that is oriented towards the logic of right. And in a way, it's the embodiment of freedom, the embodiment of freedom in society and objective spirit in Hegel's technical terms. The essential determination is liberation from sensations that man gains through habit when he is affected by them. The different forms of habit may be determined as follows. So that's an interesting passage, that we are liberated from our sensations through habit, even though habit is precisely something that deals with the natural, deals with the particular, deals with the sensuous. But it's kind of beating the senses, the sensations at their own game. Now, there is much more that can be said here. As we see, Hegel then goes on to further specify what is at work with habit, right? Because he goes into the immediate sensation, satisfaction, and talks about dexterity here, right? So going down here, he talks about how habit is a form that embraces all kinds and stages of mind's activity. So a lot of, like, there's nowhere that the logic of habit cannot, be formed or make its home, so to speak. But I will leave it there, and I hope you've learned something useful today. As we see, habit is really internal to the kind of beings we are, which for Hegel is first and foremost a self-feeling being, through which that being gains a sense of itself. And it's interesting to think about how the role of habit is connected up with feelings, because we often think of these things as different, right? But for Hegel, nothing has really motivation. You don't have any motivation to do anything unless you have feeling or desire. He has already developed feeling earlier at an earlier stage in this text, but now he pulls out the further advance of feeling, which is self-feeling, which is then habit. But it's really interesting, I think, to think about how feelings aren't something that are other to habit. Perhaps they are the immediacy of habit. Perhaps they are signals of habit. So when you feel a certain way, that is a certain habit you have been cultivating. And likewise, maybe if you cultivate something else, maybe you will feel differently, and maybe you will have a completely different sense of self. Thank you very much for listening. If there's interest, maybe I'll continue this little series and we will see how things go.